So about 15 months ago, when Bournemouth were beaten 9-0 by Liverpool, Bournemouth were in absolute disarray. There was absolute chaos surrounding the football club, and Bournemouth, by many people, were being regarded as a side to be relegated without even a formality. So much so that even Bournemouth released a video on their Twitter and their socials, even discussing the amount of people who had Bournemouth being relegated. Pundits, creators, YouTubers, almost everyone predicted Bournemouth to be relegated. Yet despite all that, Bournemouth, against all odds, managed to find a way to stay in the Premier League, and that was largely down to the absolute brilliance of Gary O'Neill coming in as manager. Gary O'Neill, without a doubt, transformed Bournemouth, and he managed to keep a side that most people expected to get relegated pretty handily in terms of finishing bottom of the Premier League, and he kept them up 5 points clear of safety, and it was a tremendous job done by Gary O'Neill. A couple of months later, in a very similar scenario, he took charge of Wolves, having been sacked by Bournemouth quite harshly, many people would have said. A lot of people had Wolves to go down. A lot of people were looking at Wolverhampton Wanderers as a side to be relegated. But once again, Gary O'Neill has worked his wonders in charge of Wolverhampton Wanderers, and less than 6-7 months in charge, Wolverhampton Wanderers, we can all say, will certainly not be relegated. And although finishing in the European places is probably too much of a stretch, it's fair to say Wolves have been one of the teams of the season, one of the surprise packages of the season in terms of beating Manchester City at home, beating Tottenham at home, doing the double over Chelsea, and even in games they've lost against big teams, they've been very competitive in the process. In today's video, we're going to be discussing the unusual rise of Gary O'Neill, because certainly as far as managers go, certainly as far as young managers go, I don't think many people ever had Gary O'Neill on their radar. But after the job he's done for Wolverhampton Wanderers and Bournemouth in such a short space of time, there's no doubt that Gary O'Neill is going to be on the radar for many. First of all, if you're new to the channel, if you could hit the like button and subscribe, it very much would be appreciated. And I suppose we'll start by Gary O'Neill in terms of a player. I imagine a lot of people probably watching this probably not too familiar with Gary O'Neill as a player, in the sense of, he wasn't the type of player who was around during that time, that sort of generation of golden midfielders of Gerrard, Lampard, Beckham, Scholes, Giggs, like so many unbelievable midfielders of that generation. Gary O'Neill was certainly not that. And before starting this video, I was even looking back at, to try find some clips or highlight reels and just see what type of a player Gary O'Neill was, and to my surprise I found very little. But what I did find, and what I did notice from some of the clips of Gary O'Neill that I did see, and even some of his interviews and look at his career trajectory, he probably was never the most gifted, the most talented player that we've seen play in the midfield in the Premier League, and he's certainly not the most gifted midfielder you would say to have ever played the game. But what he did have was a tremendous work ethic, a player who wasn't afraid to get stuck in, a player who wasn't afraid to put his absolute body on the line, no matter who he was playing and no matter what the circumstance. And it's probably fitting that Gary O'Neill has been part of so many sides that have been promoted from the Championship, so many teams that have had to escape relegation. He was a dogfighter, the type of player that you want in and around the squad when the going gets tough. And I think we do still have a lot of those players in today's era, in terms of your James Milners. In the past we had players like Gareth Barry, and I think Gary O'Neill probably doesn't have the quality of Gareth Barry and James Milner, but he was one of those type of players, and he was the type of player to give absolutely everything whilst on the pitch. And when he finished up his playing days with Bolton Wanderers, he became part of Liverpool's backroom team in their under-21s, funnily enough, which I think a lot of people maybe didn't even know. And to be honest, I didn't even know before starting the video, because when I was doing a bit of research, I was like, oh, Gary O'Neill was part of Liverpool's under-21 backroom team. That's pretty interesting. But very quickly, he jumped on board Scott Parker's runaway train to the Premier League as Bournemouth managed to get themselves back into the Premier League from the Championship. Gary O'Neill was part of the backroom team, and unfortunately, Scott Parker was not the most liked by the Bournemouth board, it's fair to say. And after pretty much, going after his players after that 9-0 defeat to Liverpool, and really not having the type of attitude that you would want, that fans would want in a manager of a team who's been newly promoted, he got the sack and he got shown the door. And whilst it did seem a bit harsh at the time, considering Bournemouth actually did have 3 points on the board after 3 games, at the same time, I think a lot of people were looking at it and thinking, yeah, the Bournemouth just don't look good at the minute. I mean, there's only been a handful of times that teams have lost 9-0 in the Premier League, and funnily enough, the last couple of times that a team has lost 9-0 in Southampton, they also managed to stay up in the same season. But you were looking at Bournemouth and you were thinking they have a lot of younger players, don't have a lot of Premier League experience. Like, they just don't look like a team that are going to be able to survive in the Premier League. Gary O'Neill came in on an interim basis, and I think most people sort of looked at it and thought, okay, Gary O'Neill's going to come in for a couple of games, but who are Bournemouth going to get as their manager? Are they going to go out and get Sam Allardyce? Are they going to get Steve Bruce, Neil Warnock, and really continue this sort of merry-go-round of average English managers that we seem to see at the best of times? Or maybe they're going to go left field and get someone with a sexy name and who plays attractive, sexy football, like what they eventually did in Andoni Iraola. But Gary O'Neill worked absolute wonders in his first couple of games as Bournemouth. As a matter of fact, Bournemouth were unbeaten in his first 6 games as in charge, which led to him being nominated for Manager of the Month. And Bournemouth went on a run, and they became very hard to beat, very solidified defensively. But at the same time, there maybe is a myth around Gary O'Neill as manager, and I think it stems from your Sean Dyches, your Sam Allardyce, Tony Pulis, all these managers who were around in the Premier League era who, done very well for a lot of the clubs they managed, but they were very negative, pragmatic, hitting teams on the counter-attack, absorbing pressure, trying to play out 0-0 draws against big teams and everything else. But Gary O'Neill's teams were never actually really like that. They actually, his Bournemouth side got after teams. They attacked. They weren't afraid to put teams on the back foot. And I think that's what gave Bournemouth a little bit of an advantage at times, was that they weren't afraid to take risks. And I think in today's football, in my opinion, I think the days of very pragmatic, low block, very overly defensive style football, I think those days are slowly fading away. I think more and more teams nowadays are playing more attacking, more sort of risk-taking football. And I think that's what's making the Premier League so exciting nowadays. But Bournemouth got after teams, and they got some big wins in the second half of the season. Firstly, beating Liverpool 1-0, laid the foundations for himself to potentially carry on as Bournemouth manager, or as it was for Andoni Iraola to come in and build off of what Gary O'Neill had in that Bournemouth team. Yeah, Gary O'Neill was surprisingly by many sacked, which I think a lot of people looked at it and thought, that's very harsh. I mean, to completely sack him sort of out of blue when he's done such a good job. But in saying that, Bournemouth did bring in Andoni Iraola, who had a very good record over Rayo Vallecano. But what's actually interesting is that when you compare both Iraola and Gary O'Neill together in terms of their managerial career, Iraola's managed for a little bit longer, but in terms of achievements, in terms of what they've both done, it's actually been very similar. The only difference is that Iraola has a sexy name with a sexy accent and probably plays sexier football. Whereas Gary O'Neill's football is still good, maybe not as expansive as someone like Iraola. However, in saying that, Wolves are above Bournemouth in the Premier League, so it's fair to say maybe Gary O'Neill is having the last laugh ever so slightly at this moment in time. And speaking of Wolves, that was the next destination for Gary O'Neill. He became Wolverhampton Wanderers manager, sort of in a similar scenario to how he became manager of Bournemouth. The then manager of Wolves, Julian Lopetegui, resigned just a couple of days before the start of the Premier League season, leaving Wolves in an absolute mess. And considering the sale of Ruben Neves and many others, a lot of people looked at Wolverhampton Wanderers as a side nailed on for relegation. Maybe not as nailed on as what Bournemouth were a season previous, but a lot of people looked at it and thought, if there's a newly promoted team that can go on a run and do very well, then maybe Wolves might be the team to get dragged into a relegation battle and could very well be the team to go down. And when Gary O'Neill was appointed as Wolverhampton Wanderers manager, a lot of people laughed, and I remember even looking on Facebook and Twitter and social media, and people were saying, like, this is a very silly appointment from Wolves, and it's very against what Wolves have normally done, because Wolves would probably have usually been the type of manager to have appointed Iraola themselves, or, they weren't usually the type of team to appoint English-style managers, and it definitely felt like an appointment that was different to the norm when it came to Wolves. And a team that wasn't spending much, a team that had very little pre-season time in terms of under their new manager, Gary O'Neill. Like, you have to remember, Gary O'Neill took over Bournemouth 3 games into the Premier League season, and he took over Wolves just a couple of days before the start of the Premier League season, meaning that he never really had time to identify transfer targets in the summer transfer windows, and he never really had time to actually work with his players and figure out what are their strengths and weaknesses. And Gary O'Neill has almost had to take it game by game in both jobs. And I think, considering how well he's done with Bournemouth and how well he's now done with Wolves, that's a testament to how good of a manager he actually is. And it was pretty clear from Wolves quite early on when we watched them play that, okay, I think they're going to be all right. The opening day defeat to Manchester United, they were very unlucky not to have gotten something from that game. Cunha, I remember, played an absolute blinder. And the more the season went on, the more you could see the quality of Wolves in players like Pedro Neto, Han Hee-Chang. They were starting to beat teams, and they were starting to get big wins over big teams, beating Tottenham, beating Manchester City. They did the double over Chelsea. And even in games they lost, as we were saying previously, I remember the game versus Liverpool as a Liverpool fan. At half-time, we should have been 2 or 3-0 down. Wolves were absolutely cutting us to shreds, and we were very fortunate in the end to come away with 3 points on that particular occasion. And the thing about Wolves is that we spoke about Bournemouth being, playing good football and everything else, but I think Gary O'Neill has taken it to the next level a little bit more so at Wolves. I think he recognises the players that Wolverhampton Wanderers have, and he's been able to get the best out of some players within Wolves that other managers haven't been able to do. Like the likes of Pedro Neto now looks an absolute baller. And don't get me wrong, I remember seeing Pedro Neto at Anfield a couple of years ago on the final day of the Premier League season. I think it was the 21-22 season. He was absolutely outstanding that day. But he's had a lot of injury problems and he probably hasn't shown it consistently enough. But now when he plays for Wolves, you can see this guy is a serious, serious talent. And yeah, for me, it's a huge testament down to the work that Gary O'Neill has done. And what's interesting with Wolves is that they have turned Molineux into an absolute fortress. I know the last 2 games have been a little bit disappointing. Obviously, the defeat to Brentford and the narrow loss to Manchester United. But for a large period of time, actually, between Wolves' defeat at home to Liverpool and their defeat at home to Manchester United, in that time period, Wolverhampton Wanderers were unbeaten at home. And that goes to show how well they were doing at home during that time period, as we said, beating the likes of Manchester City and Tottenham Hotspur in that process. And I think the thing with Gary O'Neill, I feel like his work with Wolves does go massively under the radar, and I think there's a few reasons for it. I think the first reason is that a lot of people look at the name Gary O'Neill and they instantly put him in the same bracket as a Sam Allardyce, as a Steve Bruce, as a Neil Warnock, as a Mark Hughes as well. And don't get me wrong, some of those managers had good moments in the Premier League, but they were never elite level managers. And it's probably early days to say that Gary O'Neill, I don't think you can say he is an elite level manager. I think that's going way too far with this. But he could very well be on his way to doing that, in my opinion, when you look at the work he's done with Bournemouth and Wolves. If we look at Graham Potter, for example, who was in charge for Brighton and Hove Albion for a large period of time, he had a very good sort of base to build off with things going very well behind the scenes. He had his Brighton side play good, attractive football in a similar way to Gary O'Neill's football, maybe a little bit more possession-based. But Graham Potter had way more time to work with his players in pre-season. He had time to identify transfer targets in summer transfer windows. And when you look at what Graham Potter has done at Brighton and what Gary O'Neill has done in a short space of time in Bournemouth and Wolves, who there we might say, things have been a lot more turbulent behind the scenes for Wolves and Bournemouth as they have been for Brighton. I think we all agree Brighton are a very, very well-run club, whereas Bournemouth and Wolves were in a little bit of turmoil behind the scenes when Gary O'Neill took charge. And it's fair to say Gary O'Neill has done better. He's done a lot better, and I know Graham Potter went to Chelsea and that was an absolute disaster, but I think you've seen every manager go to Chelsea under Todd Bowley and it's been an absolute disaster, so it's a hard one to judge in all honesty. But when you see Graham Potter getting linked to being the next Manchester United manager, I just think if Graham Potter's been linked to becoming the next Manchester United manager, I know things are actually going alright for United now, but should things go tits up again and Ten Hag gets sacked, Potter's been one of the men who've been heavily linked. I think if Potter's been linked, why is Gary O'Neill not being linked? Do you get what I mean? Because I don't think there's been that much of a difference between the two managers, in my opinion. And the great thing about O'Neill is that there's time to develop, there's time to learn even more. And the times I've watched him in interviews, there's times I've seen him on Monday Night Football, I think he's been very well spoken and he carries himself very, very well. And Gary O'Neill will develop, he'll become a better manager, he'll learn more things as he goes along. As we said before, this is a man who's yet to really have a summer transfer window, yet to really have a pre-season under his belt where he can work with his players even more. And look, who knows with Gary O'Neill? It's very early days in his management career. I certainly don't think we should be rushing the gun as we do with a lot of other English managers and everything else that we often see in the Premier League. I think Gary O'Neill should take his time at Wolverhampton Wanderers, But I think there is the potential for O'Neill to get a top job in the next sort of 3-4 years. Maybe even could be an outside bet to become England manager. To be fair, I do think there's other candidates that are a good bit ahead of him right now. But I think Gary O'Neill mightn't be a million miles off becoming a much better manager than people think. And again, it's testament to how well he's handled the pressure about Wolves and Bournemouth, but also I think in tough moments, Gary O'Neill as a player has been used to being able to get teams over the line when things have been really, really tough. And I think maybe that stood to him as a manager to sort of handle the pressure when defeats and bad results are happening when he's been with either of these two teams. So let me know in the comments down below. I certainly think Gary O'Neill is onto something as a manager. I certainly think there's a good future for him as manager. I think he'll stay with Wolves for a couple of years. I think we should wait and see how well he does at Wolves. But there is the potential for him to become a manager of a top team in the next 4 to 5 years. I've absolutely no doubt about it. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button and subscribe. My name is Aaron. I'll see you all later.